There are some losses that do not begin with flames. There is no explosion, no smoke, no warning sign at all. Everything still looks intact right in front of you. The trees are still green, the fruit is still ripe, the soil is still fertile. But something has already left, silently, invisibly. And by the time you realize it, it is already too late. A garden can die before it is ever burned. The most frightening thing is not the day you lose everything. It is the day you still think you own everything, while the blessing has already left you long ago. Welcome to Prophetic History Explained, where we do not just retell stories, but face truths that can change the way you see this life. If you want to understand the deeper messages hidden behind the stories in the Quran, and subscribe to the channel right now so you do not miss the next videos. Today's story does not begin with greed. It begins with a kind of person this world rarely keeps for long anymore. A man whose heart was wider than the land he owned. In the dry lands of the Arabian Peninsula, where the wind carried sand and the heat could burn through a person's will, there was a garden that existed like something almost impossible. It was not just green, it was alive. It did not just bear fruit, it nourished. People did not speak of it as a piece of land, but as a mercy. But the strange thing is, the blessing of that garden did not begin with the soil. It began with a man. He was not a king. He had no soldiers, no power, no storehouses overflowing with gold. But whenever harvest season came, the poor would come to his gate as if they were stepping into the safest place on earth. No one was asked for a reason. No one was turned away. No one had to feel ashamed to receive. He did not give like a man handing out charity. He gave like someone who understood that he did not truly own anything. Before any fruit was brought into his home, he set aside the best portion for those who had nothing. Before his own family enjoyed it, the widows, the orphans, and the forgotten were fed first. There was no showmanship, no calculation, no sense of loss. There was only one clear belief. Everything he was holding was only in a manner, a trust. And every evening, when the sun sank below the horizon and the garden rested in gentle light, he would lift his head to the sky and say words no one heard, except the one who had given him everything. My Allah, this is not mine. This is yours. Please use it as you will. There are words that do not change the world instantly, but still keep a world from falling apart. While the lands around him struggled with drought, pests, and failed harvests, his garden kept thriving. Not because he worked harder, not because he was smarter, but because something invisible covered that land, something no one could buy, no one could measure. But that could be lost in a single moment, barakah, blessing. But then, like all people, his time also came to leave. There was no noise, no great preparation, just an ordinary evening, when his hands still carried the scent of soil, when his lips were still whispering familiar words of Dika. His soul left his body as gently as he had lived. The garden was still there the next day. The trees were still standing. The fruit was still ripe. Everything seemed unchanged. But something was different. The wind no longer carried the same feeling of peace. The birds no longer sounded as warm as before, and the people who once came there with hope began to feel an emptiness they could not name, because the one who had kept that place alive was gone. His sons stood before the garden, looking at everything their father had left behind, but they did not see what their father had seen. They did not see a manna. They saw opportunity. They did not see responsibility. They saw profit. And from that moment on, something began to change, not in the garden, but in their hearts. Some collapses do not begin with actions. They begin with the way you see the world, and once that way of seeing changes, everything after that is only a matter of time. Change rarely happens in one obvious moment. It does not arrive like a storm everyone can recognize. It comes slowly, very slowly, slipping into the way people look at things, until even they no longer realize when they became different. After the father was gone, the garden kept growing as if it had never lost its caretaker. The branches were still heavy with fruit, and the stream still moved quietly through the roots. But in the eyes of the sons, where they had once seen Allah's provision, something else was now reflected back. They began to look at the garden no longer as an amana, but as an asset. No longer as something to protect, but as something to exploit. No longer as a place to share, but as a source to accumulate. At first, the change was very small, just passing thoughts, half-joking comments. Father gave away too much. If we had kept more, we would have been rich a long time ago. Those words did not sound dangerous. They sounded reasonable, even practical. But right there, an invisible line had already been crossed. Because from the moment people begin measuring kindness by personal gain, they are no longer standing on the path they think they are on. One evening, they sat together in the room where their father used to remind them about the cur and about gratitude, about responsibility toward the weak. But today, that room no longer held those reminders. The quiet weight of faith was gone. All that was left was calculation. The oldest brother spoke first. His voice was not loud, but it was firm. We cannot keep going like this. If we keep giving the way Father did, we will have nothing left. The others did not object, because deep down, they had been thinking the same thing. They just had never dared to say it out loud before. Another one followed, his voice edged with bitterness. People come to this garden not because they are poor. They come because they know they will always be given something, and we just keep letting it happen. No one mentioned that those people truly needed help. No one mentioned the prayers this garden had once received. When the heart begins to drift, memory becomes selective too, keeping only what serves the new way of thinking. They began looking back at the past, not with gratitude, but with justification. But not all of them stayed silently in agreement. The middle brother, the only one among them who still held on to some of the light their father had taught them, felt that something was wrong. He could not explain it clearly, but inside him was a heavy feeling, as if something precious was being lost, and no one noticed. He looked at his brothers, the same men who had grown up beside him under those trees, who had heard the same teachings, who had witnessed the same way of life, but now they spoke like strangers. He spoke up, not to argue, but like one last reminder. Do you really think this garden exists like this because of us? Or because of what Father did? Because of his prayers? Because of the way he treated people? The room fell silent for a brief moment. But it was not the silence of reflection. It was the silence before resistance. The oldest brother looked at him, and his eyes were no longer soft. Father lived his way, we will live ours. The answer was short, clear, final. Another brother gave a light laugh, but there was no joy in it. If you want to keep giving like Father did, that is your choice. But do not drag us into it. Those words were not loud, they were not harsh, but they were enough to reveal one thing. They had made their decision. Not just a decision about whether to give or not give, a decision about who they wanted to become. The middle brother said nothing more, not because he had nothing left to say, but because he realized that when hearts are covered by calculation, words no longer have enough strength to reach them. He fell silent, but that silence was not agreement. It was the helpless silence of someone who sees the right path, but cannot pull others back to it. As for the others, they left the room feeling as if they had just reached an important agreement. None of them felt they were doing anything wrong. On the contrary, they felt they were becoming wiser, more practical, and that is exactly what makes it so dangerous. Because when people begin calling greed wisdom, they stop looking for repentance. There was no thunder, no sign from the sky. Everything remained as quiet as before, but inside that very quiet, a shift had already been completed, not in the garden, but in the hearts of the ones who inherited it. Some decisions do not need noise to become dangerous. They are made in silence, in small nods, in shared looks that do not need words. And because nothing dramatic happens, people easily mistake them for harmless choices. That is how their plan was formed. Not in anger, not in some heated argument, but in the cold calm of people who believed they were doing the right thing. They did not think they were betraying their father's legacy. They thought they were correcting his mistake. The idea was very simple, and because it was so simple, it became dangerous. They would go to the garden very early, before the first light touched the ground, before anyone in the village woke up, before the poor could come the way they always did. They would harvest everything, quickly and neatly, leaving nothing behind. No one would see. No one would ask. No one would be there for them to refuse. And that way, they would not have to face their guilt. This was not just a plan about timing. It was a way to avoid their conscience. They did not say it directly, but they all understood. If they saw those hungry eyes, if they heard those familiar pleas, if they stood in front of the very people their father used to help, it would be harder to turn away. So they decided to remove that possibility from the beginning, not by refusing, but by never allowing the moment of refusal to happen. One of them spoke softly, as if stating the obvious. We have to go before sunrise. No one objected. No one asked another question. No one mentioned Allah. No one said Inshallah. Tomorrow, in their minds, was guaranteed. They spoke about tomorrow as if it were already in their hands, as if planning it was enough to make everything happen exactly the way they wanted. There was no hesitation, no humility, not one moment of acknowledging that some things are not under human control. And that was where a gap appeared. Not a gap in the plan, a gap in dependence on Allah. The middle brother stood at the edge of the conversation. He heard every word, every detail, and inside him, that heavy feeling from earlier became clearer. This was no longer just a small wrong decision. This was a step away from the path they had once been taught to follow. He tried one more time, not to win an argument, but to save whatever could still be saved. Do you realize that we are making this plan without even mentioning Allah? We are talking about tomorrow as if it certainly belongs to us. His words were not answered with logic. They were dismissed. One of them waved a hand, as if brushing away something unimportant. Do not make this more complicated than it is. This is just harvesting. Just harvesting. Two simple words, but hidden inside them was a dangerous reduction, turning a moral decision into a technical action. Once people do that, they no longer feel they are doing wrong. They began to prepare. No ritual, no prayer, no stillness before action. Only the quiet rush of people trying to finish something before anyone could see them. That night, they went to sleep with a strange feeling. Not guilt, anticipation. They imagined tomorrow, the amount of fruit they would gather, what they could do with it, how different life would become once they no longer had to share. In their imagination, everything went perfectly. No one got in the way, no obstacle appeared, no surprise arrived. But there was one thing they could not imagine. What would happen if their plan was not the only plan already in motion? As night settled deeper and the sounds of the world faded into silence, another reality existed beyond what they could see. A reality where intentions do not need to be spoken to be recorded, where silent decisions still carry the weight of clear actions. And in that reality, everything had already begun to move. They heard nothing, saw nothing, felt nothing. But there are moments when silence is not a sign of peace. It is a sign that something has already been decided. When they closed their eyes, believing tomorrow would belong to them, they did not know that in that very moment, their tomorrow had already become something nothing like what they had imagined. Not because they failed to prepare enough, but because they forgot one thing, that no plan exists independently from the will of Allah. And when people make plans in the darkness of self-confidence, they rarely realize they are stepping into an ending that has already been written. That morning, dawn arrived, but it did not bring what they were expecting. The sky changed color the way it always did, from black to pale purple, and then slowly into light. There was no sign warning them that their world had changed. No storm, no strange sound. Everything was still, suspiciously still, as if the silence itself were hiding something irreversible. They walked quickly, barely looking at one another. Not because there was nothing to say, but because every mind was occupied with the same thought. Today would be the beginning of a different life. As they came closer to the garden, the light was just enough to make out the familiar shapes. The gate was still there. The rows of trees still stood in silence. There was no sign of disturbance. No strangers, no footsteps from the porch. Everything was unfolding exactly according to their plan, at least, until the moment they stepped inside. At first, no one realized it right away, because people usually need a little time to accept that what is in front of them is real. They took a few steps, looked around, and then stopped. One narrowed his eyes, as if the light was still too weak to see clearly. Another moved faster, pushing farther in, as if the deeper he went, the more everything would return to normal. But the farther they went, the clearer the wrongness became. There was no fragrance of ripe fruit, no familiar rustling of leaves, no feeling of life that this garden had always carried. The air was heavy, dry, and strange in a way they could not explain. Then one of them stopped completely. He bent down and touched a branch. The moment his fingers made contact, the bark broke apart like dust. Not like wood, not like a living tree, but like something that had been emptied of life from the inside. He pulled his hand back and stared at the fragments clinging to his skin as if they belonged to something impossible. No, this cannot be. The others began to look more closely, no longer with quick glances, but with inspection, with searching, with panic beginning to take shape. The trees were no longer green. The leaves were no longer soft. The fruit was no longer whole. Everything carried a dark, dry, lifeless look. There was no sign of fire the way people understand fire. No flames. No ash drifting through the air. But everything looked as though it had been burned from within. One of them stepped back several paces and shook his head. We came to the wrong place. That is the mind's first response to shock. Denial. This is not our garden. The words were repeated, not to convince the others, but to calm himself. Because if this was not their garden, then maybe everything could still go back to the way it was. But then another one pointed toward the gate. A familiar mark, simple and old, had been there for a long time, a mark their father had left behind. There was no mistaking it, no denying it. The truth stood there, clearer than any words. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, but because no words were large enough for what they were seeing. Then a voice came out, quiet but heavy, as if each word had to push through an invisible force. We have been deprived. There was no more doubt, no more assumptions, no more plans. Only a reality they could not change. And then, like a dam breaking, the emotions rushed out. This is your fault. One of them turned on another, his voice trembling. You were the one who said we should keep everything. And what about you? The other fired back immediately. You agreed. You said nothing when we made the decision. The accusations came faster than thought. No one tried to stay composed anymore. No one cared about appearances. They were no longer the men who had carefully made a plan. They had become people cornered by loss, trying to shove responsibility away from themselves. We only wanted to keep what was ours. Ours. Another voice cut in. Since when was it ever ours? That question was not answered right away, but it did not disappear. It hung in the air, heavier than any accusation. One of them dropped to his knees, grabbing the soil, but what he held was no longer soil. It was dry, brittle, and empty. He clenched his fist as if he could force life back into it. We were wrong. His voice no longer carried defiance, no longer defense, only realization. It was not that they had lost a harvest. It was not that they had bad luck. It was not that nature had betrayed them. They had walked into an outcome already written by the very choices they had made. They had planned to keep others from coming to the garden. And now, they themselves had nothing left to receive from it. None of them needed anyone to explain what had happened. No one needed to look up at the sky for an answer, because the answer was not outside. It was already there in what they had intended to do, before any action had even taken place. And in that moment, they understood something they had never understood before, that some losses are not punishment for what you did. They are the answer to what you intended to do. Not every collapse ends in despair. Some collapses open a door people can only see when they have nothing left to hold on to. They stood in the middle of a dead garden, but what was happening was no longer about burned trunks or shattered branches. It was happening inside them. A slow, painful, unstoppable change, like a mirror finally being wiped clean after being covered for a long time. The middle brother was the one who broke the silence, not with blame, not with victory, but with a truth no one had the strength to deny anymore. This is not just a loss, he said, his voice low but clear. This is a warning. No one argued. No one pushed back. Because for the first time, they were no longer trying to protect their pride. They were no longer standing in the position of people who were right. They were standing in the position of people who had finally seen the truth about themselves. One of them spoke, his voice breaking. We wronged the poor. There was no more justification, no more excuses, only admission. Another followed, unable to lift his eyes. We wronged our father. That sentence seemed to make the air grow heavier, not because it was new, but because they were finally understanding it in a way they never had before. They had not only gone against their father's teaching, they had betrayed the very thing that made him who he was. Then another voice, quieter, but heavier than all the rest. We wronged Allah. There was nothing left to add, nothing left to hide. They no longer looked at the garden the same way. They did not see it anymore as income, property, or opportunity. For the first time, they saw it for what it truly was, a gift they had never known how to keep. One of them fell to his knees, not out of weakness, but because there was no longer any reason to stand tall in pride. His hand touched the ground, the same ground that had once fed so many people. Now it was barren. But in that very barrenness, he felt something he had never felt before: truth, our Lord. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from sincerity finally stripped of self-interest. We have wronged ourselves. The others did not remain standing. One by one, they knelt without being told. No ritual, no arrangement. Just the natural response of hearts that had finally realized how far they had wandered. No one asked for the garden to return. No one demanded a miracle. No one bargained with Allah. They only asked to be forgiven. And right there, something strange happened. Not on the ground, not in the sky, but inside them, the heaviness began to change. It did not disappear completely, but it no longer crushed them the same way. It became something else: awakening, understanding, the kind no one can teach with words alone. The oldest brother, the one who had led the plan, now spoke more slowly than ever before. We thought keeping more would make us stronger. He stopped and looked down at his own hands, which now held nothing. But giving was the very thing that had been keeping everything alive. No one disagreed. No one needed confirmation, because they had seen it with their own eyes. Another one spoke, as if he was speaking to himself. We were afraid of losing, but we never realized that what we had was never truly ours. Those words were not philosophy, not some memorized lesson. They were the result of an experience only those who have truly lost something can understand. The middle brother looked at them and no longer saw resistance, no longer saw stubbornness. He only saw people who had finally returned to the point they had left long ago. We cannot get back what was lost, he said, but we can return to the path our father walked, not to get the garden back, but to find ourselves again. No one asked whether that would bring anything in return. No one demanded a guarantee, because for the first time, they were not doing something for the outcome. They were doing it because it was right. They rose, not like victors, but like people who had just been given a second chance, not to repair the past, but to keep from repeating it. When they walked away from the garden, nothing had changed on the outside. The trees were still dead, the soil was still dry. There was no sign that any miracle had happened. But inside them, something had been planted, not the seed of wealth, but the seed of return. And there are some seeds that can only begin to grow after everything else has been destroyed. The deepest lesson is not that they were punished. It is that they only recognized the value of blessing after the blessing had already left. And that is what we face every single day, often without realizing it. Ask yourself honestly, is there something in your life that you are taking for granted? A steady job, a family still by your side, health that has not yet been taken away, an opportunity you assume will always be there. Are you looking at those things as gifts or as possessions? Are you delaying giving, delaying helping, delaying returning to Allah, simply because you think there is still time? If the answer is yes, then remember this. The people in the story once thought the same way. Applying this lesson does not begin with grand gestures. It begins with small things that are very real. Train yourself to look again at what you already have and remind yourself, this is not mine, this is a trust. Train yourself to give, not only when you have more than enough, but even when you still hesitate. Train yourself to say Insha'Allah not just with words, but with a real acknowledgement that you do not control tomorrow. And most importantly, correct your intention before the action ever happens. Because sometimes what Allah looks at is not only what you did, but what you intended to do. If this story made you think, if you feel like something inside you has just been awakened, then you should not keep it to yourself. Join the Prophetic History Explained community so we can continue exploring more profound stories from the Quran and understand the lessons hidden behind each event more clearly and slowly change the way we see life. And do not forget to subscribe to support the channel so we can have more motivation to keep bringing you deeper and more meaningful content in the videos ahead.